Part 1 of Chapter 1 of XYZ, a Detective Story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carolyn. XYZ, a Detective Story by Anna Katharine Green. Part 1 of Chapter 1, The Mysterious Rendezvous. Sometimes in the course of his experience, a detective, while engaged in ferreting out the mystery of one crime, runs inadvertently upon the clue to another. But rarely has this been done in a manner more unexpected or with attendant circumstances of greater interest than in the instance I am now about to relate. For some time the penetration of certain Washington officials had been baffled by the clever devices of a gang of counterfeiters who had inundated the western portion of Massachusetts with spurious Treasury notes. Some of the best talent of the Secret Service had been expended upon the matter, but with no favorable result, when, one day, notice was received at Washington that a number of suspicious-looking letters, addressed to the simple initials XYZ, Braddon, Massachusetts, were being daily forwarded through the mails of that region, and it being deemed possible that a clue had at last been offered to the mystery in hand, I was sent northward to investigate. It was in the middle of June, 1881, and the weather was simply delightful. As I stepped from the cars at Braddon and looked up the long straight street with its double row of maple trees, sparkling fresh and beautiful in the noonday sun, I thought I had never seen a prettier village or entered upon any enterprise with a lighter or more hopeful heart. Intent on my task, I went straight to the post office, and after coming to an understanding with the postmaster, proceeded at once to look over the mail addressed to the mysterious XYZ. I found it to consist entirely of letters. They were about a dozen in number, and were, with one exception, similar in general appearance and manner of direction, though inscribed in widely different handwritings, and posted from various New England towns. The exception to which I allude had these few extra words written in the lower left-hand corner of the envelope: "To be kept till called for." As I bundled up the letters preparatory to thrusting them back into the box, I noticed that the latter was the only one in a blue envelope, all the others being in the various shades of cream color and buff. "Who is in the habit of calling for these letters?" I asked of the postmaster. "Well," said he, "I don't know his name. The fact is, nobody knows him around here. He usually drives up in a buggy about nightfall, calls for the letters addressed to XYZ, and having got them, whips up his horse and is off again before one can say a word." "Describe him," said I. "Well, he is very lean and very lank. In appearance he is both green and awkward. His complexion is pale, almost sickly. Were it not for his eye, which is keen and twinkling, I should call him an extremely inoffensive-looking person." The type was not new to me. "I should like to see him," said I. "You will have to wait till nightfall, then," returned the postmaster. "He never comes till about dusk. Drop in here, say at 7 o'clock, and I will see that you have the opportunity of handing him his mail." I nodded acquiescence to this, and sauntered out of the enclosure devoted to the uses of the post office. As I did so, I ran against a young man who was hurriedly approaching from the other end of the store. "Your pardon," he cried, and I turned to look at him, so gentlemanly was his tone, and so easy the bow with which he accompanied this simple apology. He was standing before the window of the post office, waiting for his mail. A good-looking, well-made young man, of a fine countenance, but with a restless eye, whose alert yet anxious expression I could not but notice, even in the casual glance I gave him. There appeared to be some difficulty in procuring him his mail, and each minute he was kept waiting seemed to increase his impatience almost beyond the bounds of endurance. I saw him lean forward and gasp out a hurried word to the postmaster, and was idly wondering over his anxiety and its probable causes, when I heard a hasty exclamation near me, and looking around, saw the postmaster himself beckoning to me from the door of the enclosure. I immediately hastened forward. "I don't know what it means," he whispered, "but here is a young man, different from any who have been here before, asking for a letter addressed to XYZ." "A letter?" I repeated. "Yes, a letter." "Give him the whole batch and see what he does," I returned, drawing back where I could myself watch the result of my instructions. The postmaster did as I requested. In another moment I saw the young man start with amazement, as a dozen letters were put in his hand. "These are not all for me," he cried, but even as he made the exclamation, drew to one side, and with a look of mingled perplexity and concern, began opening them one after another, his expression deepening to amazement as he glanced at their contents. The one in the blue envelope, however, seemed to awaken quite different emotions. With an unconscious look of relief, he hastily read the short letter it contained, then with a quick gesture, folded it up and thrust it back into the envelope he held, together with the other letters, in his left hand. "There must be another XYZ," said he, approaching the window of the post office and handing back all the letters he had received, with the exception of the one in the blue envelope, which with a quick movement he had separated from the rest and thrust into his coat pocket. "I can lay claim to none of these," and with a repetition of his easy bow he turned away, and hurriedly quitted the store, followed by the eyes of clerks and customers, to whom he was evidently as much of a stranger as he was to me. Without hesitation I went to the door and looked after him. He was just crossing the street to the tavern on the other side of the way. I saw him enter, felt that he was safe to remain there for a few minutes, and conscious of the great opportunity awaiting me, hastened back to the postmaster. "Well," cried I, in secret exultation, "our plan has worked admirably. Let me see the letters. As they have been opened, and through no fault of ours, a peep at them now in the cause of justice will harm no one but the guilty." The postmaster demurred, but I soon overcame his scruples, and taking down the letters once more, hastily investigated their contents. I own that I was considerably disappointed at the result. In fact, I found nothing that pointed toward the counterfeiters. Only in each letter a written address, together with 50 cents worth of stamps. "Some common fraud," I exclaimed. "One of those cheap affairs where, for 50 cents enclosed, a piece of information calculated to ensure fortune to the recipient is promised by return of mail." And disgusted with the whole affair, I bundled up the letters, and was about to replace them in the box for the third time, when I discovered that it still held a folded paper. Drawing this out, I opened it and started in fresh amazement. If I was not very much mistaken in the appearance of the letter in the blue envelope, which I had seen the young man read with so much interest, this was certainly it. But how came it here? Had I not seen him thrust it back into its envelope, and afterward put envelope and all into his pocket? But here was no envelope, and here was the letter. By what freak of necromancy had it been transferred from its legitimate quarters to this spot? I could not imagine. Suddenly I remembered that his hand had been full of the other letters when he put, or endeavored to put, this special one back into its envelope, and however unaccountable it may seem, it must be that from haste or agitation he had only succeeded in thrusting it between two letters, instead of into the envelope, as he supposed. Whether or not this explanation be true, there was no doubt about my luck being in the ascendant. Mastering my satisfaction, I read these lines written in what appeared to be a disguised hand: "All goes well. The time has come. Everything is in train, and success is certain. Be in the shrubbery at the northeast corner of the grounds at 9 p.m. precisely. You will be given a mask and such other means as are necessary to ensure you the accomplishment of the end you have in view. He cannot hold out against a surprise. The word by which you will know your friends is counterfeit." "Aha!" thought I, "this is more like it." And moved by a sudden impulse, I hastily copied the letter into my memorandum book, and then returning to the original, scratched out with my penknife the word northeast, and carefully substituting that of southwest, put the letter back into the box, in the hope that, when he came to consult the envelope in his pocket, as he would be sure to do sooner or later, he would miss its contents and return to the post office in search of it. Nor was I mistaken. I had scarcely accomplished my task when he re-entered the store, asked to see the letters he had returned, and finding amongst them the one he had lost, disappeared with it back into the tavern. If he is surprised to read southwest this time instead of northeast, he will think his memory played him false in the first instance, cried I, in inward comment over my last doubtful stroke of policy. And turning to the postmaster, I asked him what place there was in the vicinity which could be said to possess grounds and a shrubbery. "There is but one," he returned, "Mr. Benson's. All the rest of the folks are too poor to indulge in any such gimcracks." "And who is Mr. Benson?" "Well, he is Mr. Benson, the richest man in these parts and the least liked, as I take it. He came here from Boston 2 years ago, and built a house fit for a king to live in. Why, nobody knows, for he seems to take no pleasure in it. His children do, though, and that is all he cares for, I suppose. Young Mr. Benson especially seems to be never tired of walking about the grounds, looking at the trees and tying up the vines. Miss Carrie is different. All she wants is company. But little of that has her father ever allowed her till this very day. He seems to think nobody's good enough to sit down in his parlors, and yet he don't sit there himself, the strange man, but is always shut up in his library or some other out-of-the-way place." "A busy man?" "I suppose so, but no one ever sees anything he does." "Writes, perhaps?" "I don't know. He never talks about himself." "How did he get his money?" "That we don't know. It seems to accumulate without his help or interference. When he came here he was called rich, but to-day he is said to be worth 3 times what he was then." "Perhaps he speculates." "If he does, it must be through his son, for he never leaves home himself." "Has 2 children, you say?" "Yes, a son and a daughter. A famous young man, the son, not so much liked perhaps as universally respected. He is too severe and reticent to be a favorite, but no one ever found him doing anything unworthy of himself. He is the pride of the county, and if he were a bit suaver in manner, might have been in Congress at this minute." "How old?" 30, I should say." "And the girl?" 25, perhaps." "A mother living?" "No, there were some strange stories of her having died a year or so before they came here, under circumstances of a somewhat distressing nature, but they themselves say nothing about it." "It seems to me they don't say much about anything." "That's just it. They are the most reserved people you ever saw. It isn't from them we have heard there's another son floating somewhere about the world. They never speak of him, and what's more, they never write to him, as who should know better than myself." An interruption here occurred, and I took the opportunity to saunter out into the crowd of idlers away, to be found hanging around in a country store at mail time. My purpose was, as you might conceive, to pick up any stray bits of information that might be floating about concerning these Bensons. Not that I had as yet discovered anything definite connecting this respectable family with the gang of counterfeiters upon whose track I had been placed, but business is business, and no clue, however slight or unpromising in its nature, is to be neglected when the way is as dark as that which lay before me. With an easy smile, therefore, calculated to allay apprehension and awaken confidence, I took my stand among these loungers, but I soon found that I need do nothing to start the wheel of gossip on the subject of the Bensons. It was already going, and that with a force and spirit that almost took my breath away. "A fancy ball!" were the first words I heard. "The Bensons give a fancy ball when they never had 3 persons at a time in their house before." "Yes, and what's more, they're going to have folks over from Clayton and Lawrence and Hollowell and devil knows where. It's to be a smash up, a regular fandango, with masks and all that kind of nonsense. They say Miss Carrie teased her father till he had to give in self-defense. It's her birthday or something like that, and she would have a party." "But such a party! Who ever heard the like in a respectable town like this? It's wicked, that's what I call it, downright wicked, to cover up the face God has given you, and go strutting around in clothes a Christian man might well think borrowed from the evil one if he had to wear them in any decent company. All wrong, I say, all wrong. And I am astonished at Mr. Benson. To keep his doors shut as he has, and then to open them in a burst to all sorts of folly. We are not invited at our house." "Nor we, nor we," shouted some half dozen. "And I don't know of any one in this town who is," cried a burly man, presumably butcher by trade. "We are not good enough for the Bensons. They say he is even going to be mean enough to shut the gates and not let a soul inside who hasn't a ticket. And they are going to light up the grounds, too. We can peep through the fence. Much we will see that way. If you had said climb it. We can't climb it. Big John is going to be there, and Tom Henshaw. They mean to keep their good times to themselves, just as they have kept everything else. It's a queer set they are, anyway. And the less we have to do with them, the better." "I should like to see Hartley Benson in a masquerade costume, I would." "Oh, he won't wear any of the fol de rol. He's too dignified." And with that there fell a sudden hush over the crowd, for which I was at a loss to account, till, upon looking up, I saw approaching on horseback a young man in whom I had no difficulty in recognizing the subject of the last remark. Straight, slight, elegant in appearance, but with an undoubted reserve of manner apparent even at a distance, he rode up to where I stood, and casting a slight glance around, bowed almost imperceptibly and alighted. A boy caught the bridle of his horse, and Mr. Benson, without a word or further look, passed quickly into the office, leaving a silence behind him that was not disturbed till he returned with what was evidently his noonday mail. Remounting his horse, he stopped a moment to speak to a man who had just come up, and I seized the opportunity to study his face. I did not like it. It was handsome, without doubt. The features were regular, the complexion fair, the expression gentlemanly if not commanding, but I did not like it. It was too impenetrable, perhaps, and to a detective anxious to probe a man for his motives, this is ever a most fatal defect. His smile was without sunshine. His glance was an inquiry, a rebuke, a sarcasm, everything but a revelation. As he rode away he carried with him the thought of all, yet I doubt if the admiration he undoubtedly inspired was in a single case mixed with any warmer feeling than that of pride in a fellow townsman they could not understand. Ice, thought I, ice in all but its transparency. So much for Benson the son. End of Part 1 of Chapter 1. Part 2 of Chapter 1 of XYZ, a Detective Story by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Part 2 of Chapter 1. The Mysterious Rendezvous. The ball was to take place that very night, and the knowledge of this fact threw a different light over the letter I had read. The word mask had no longer any special significance, neither the word counterfeit, and yet such was the tenor of the note itself, and such the exaggerated nature of its phrases, I could not but feel that some plot of a reprehensible, if not criminal nature was in the process of formation, which, as a rising young detective engaged in a mysterious and elusive search, it behooved me to know. And moved by this consideration, I turned to a new leaf in my memorandum book, and put down in black and white the following facts thus summarily collected. A mysterious family with a secret. Rich, but with no visible means of wealth. Secluded, with no apparent reason for the same. A father who is a hermit. A son who is impenetrable. A daughter whose tastes are seldom gratified. The strange fact of a ball being given by this family after years of reserve and non-intercourse with their neighbors. The still stranger fact of its being a masquerade, a style of entertainment which, from its novelty and the opportunities it affords, makes this departure from ordinary rules seem marked and startling. The discovery of a letter appointing a rendezvous between two persons of the male sex in the grounds of the party giving this ball, in which the opportunities afforded by a masquerade are to be used for forwarding some long cherished scheme. At the bottom of this I wrote the deduction: some connection between one or two members of this family giving the ball and the person called to the rendezvous, the entertainment being used as a blind, if not as a means. It was now 4 o'clock, 5 hours before the time of rendezvous. How should I employ the interval? A glance at the livery stable hard by determined me. Procuring a horse, I rode out on the road towards Mr. Benson's for the purpose of reconnoitring the grounds, but as I proceeded I was seized by an intense desire to penetrate into the midst of this peculiar household, and judge for myself whether it was worth while to cherish any further suspicions in regard to this family. But how to effect such an entrance? What excuse could I give for my intrusion that would be likely to serve me on a day of such tumult and preoccupation? I looked up and down the road as if for inspiration. It did not come. Meanwhile, the huge trees that surrounded the house had loomed in sight, and presently the beauties of lawn and parterre began to appear beyond the high iron fence, through which I could catch now and then short glimpses of hurrying forms, as lanterns were hung on the trees, and all things put in readiness for the evening's entertainment. Suddenly a thought struck me. If Mr. Benson was the man they said, he was not engaged in any of these arrangements. Mr. Benson was a hermit. Now, what could I say that would interest a hermit? I racked my brains. A single idea came. It was daring in its nature, but what of that? The gate must be passed, Mr. Benson must be seen, or so my adventurous curiosity decided, and to do it, something must be ventured. Taking out my card, which was simply inscribed with my name, I wrote on it, "Business, private and immediate," and assuming my most gentlemanly and inoffensive manner, rode calmly through the gate to the front of the house. If I had been on foot, I doubt if I would have been allowed to pass by the servant lounging about in that region, but the horse carried me through in more senses than one, and almost before I realized it, I found myself pausing before the portico, in full view of a dozen or more busy men and boys. Imitating the manner of Mr. Benson at the post office, I jumped from my horse and threw the bridle to the boy nearest me. Instantly, and before I could take a step, a servant issued from the open door, and with an expression of anxiety somewhat surprising under the circumstances, took his stand before me in a way to hinder my advance. "Mr. Benson does not receive visitors to-day," said he. "I am not a visitor," replied I. "I have business with Mr. Benson," and I handed him my card, which he looked at with a doubtful expression. "Mr. Benson's commands are not to be disobeyed," persisted the man. "My master sees no one to-day." "But this is an exceptional case," I urged, my curiosity rising at this unexpected opposition. "My business is important and concerns him. He cannot refuse to see me." The servant shook his head with what appeared to me to be an unnecessary expression of alarm, but nevertheless retreated a step, allowing me to enter. "I will call Mr. Hartley," cried he. But that was just what I did not wish. It was Benson the father I had come to see, and I was not to be baffled in this way. "Mr. Hartley won't do," said I, in my lowest but most determined accents. "If Mr. Benson is not ill, I must beg to be admitted to his presence." And stepping inside the small reception room at my right, I sat down on the first chair I came to. The man stood for a moment confounded at my pertinacity, then with a last scrutinizing look, that took in every detail of my person and apparel, drew slowly off, shaking his head and murmuring to himself. Meanwhile, The mingled splendor and elegance of my surroundings were slowly making their impression upon me. The hall by which I had entered was spacious and imposing. The room in which I sat, a model of beauty in design and finish. I was allowing myself the luxury of studying its pictures and numerous works of art, when the sound of voices reached my ear from the next room. A man and woman were conversing there in smothered tones, but my senses are very acute, and I had no difficulty in overhearing what was said. "Oh, what an exciting day this has been!" cried the female voice. "I have wanted to ask you a dozen times what you think of it all. Will it succeed this time? Has he the nerve to embrace his opportunity, or what is more, the tact to make one? Failure now would be fatal. Father—" "Hush!" broke in the other voice, in a masculine tone of repressed intensity. "Do not forget that success depends on your prudence. One whisper of what you are about, and the whole scheme is destroyed." "I will be careful. Only, do you think that all is going well and as we planned it?" "It will not be my fault if it does not," was the reply, uttered with an accent so sinister I was conscious of a violent surprise when, in the next instant, the other, with a burst of affectionate fervour, cried in an ardent tone, "Oh, how good you are, and what a comfort you are to me!" I was just pondering over the incongruity thus presented, when the servant returned with my card. "Mr. Benson wishes to know the nature of your business," said he, in a voice I was uncomfortably conscious must penetrate to the next room, and awake its inmates to a knowledge of my proximity. "Let me have the card," said I, and taking it, I added to my words the simple phrase, "On behalf of the constable of the town," remembering I had heard the postmaster say this position was held by his brother. "There," said I, "carry that back to your master." The servant took the card, glanced down at the words I had written, started and hastily drew back. "You had better come," said he, leading the way into the hall. I was only too glad to comply. In fact, escape from that room seemed imperative. But just as I was crossing the threshold, a sudden, quick cry, half joyful, half fearful, rose behind me, and turning, I met the eyes of a young lady peering upon me from a lifted portière, with an expression of mingled terror and longing that would have astonished me greatly, if it had not instantly disappeared at the first sight of my face. "Pardon me," she exclaimed, drawing back with an embarrassed movement into the room from which she had emerged. But soon recovering herself she stepped hastily forward, and ignoring me, said to the servant at my side, "Jonas, who is this gentleman, and where are you taking him?" With a bow, Jonas replied, "He comes on business, miss, and Mr. Benson consents to see him." "But I thought my father had expressly commanded that no one was to be allowed to enter the library to day," she exclaimed, but in a musing tone that asked for no response. And hastily as we passed down the hall, I could not escape the uneasy sense that her eager eyes were following us as we went. Too much emotion for so small a matter, and a strange desire on the part of every one to keep Mr. Benson from being intruded upon to-day, was my mental comment. And I was scarcely surprised when upon our arrival at the library door we found it locked. However, a knock, followed by a few whispered words on the part of the servants, served to arouse the hermit within, and with a quick turn of the key, the door flew back on its hinges, and the master of the house stood before me. It was a moment to be remembered. First, because the picture presented to my eyes was of a marked and impressive character, and secondly, because something in the expression of the gentleman before me showed that he had received a shock at my introduction which was not to be expected after the pains which had been taken to prepare his mind for my visit. He was a tall, remarkable-looking man, with a head already whitened, and a form which, if not bowed, had only retained its upright carriage by means of the indomitable will that betrayed itself in his eyes. Seen against the rich background of the stained glass window that adorned one end of the apartment, his stern, furrowed face and eagerly repellent aspect imprinted itself upon me like a silhouette, while the strong emotion I could not but detect in his bearing lent to the whole a poetic finish that made it a living picture which, as I have said, I have never been able to forget. "You have come from the constable of the town," said he, in a firm, hard tone, impressive as his look. "May I ask for what purpose?" Looking around, I saw the servant had disappeared. "Sir," said I, gathering up my courage, as I became convinced that in this case I had a thoroughly honest man to deal with, "you are going to give a fancy ball to night. Such an event is a novelty in these parts, and arouses much curiosity. Some of the men about town have even been heard to threaten to leap the fences and steal a look at your company, whether you will or not. Mr. White wants to know whether you need any assistance in keeping the ground clear of all but your legitimate guests. If so, he is ready to supply whatever force you may need." "Mr. White is very kind," returned Mr. Benson, in a voice which, despite his will power, showed that his agitation had in some unaccountable way been increased by my communication. "I had not thought of any such contingency," he murmured, moving over to a window and looking out. "An invasion of rowdies would not be agreeable. They might even find their way into the house." He paused and cast a sudden look at me. "Who are you?" he abruptly asked. The question took me by surprise, but I answered bravely if not calmly. "I am a man who sometimes assists Mr. White in the performance of his duties, and in case you need it, will be the one to render you assistance to night. A line to Mr. White, if you doubt me." A wave of his meagre hand stopped me. "Do you think you could keep out of my house to night any one I did not wish to enter?" he asked. "I should at least like to try." "A ticket is given to every invited guest, but if men are going to climb the fences, tickets will amount to but little." "I will see that the fences are guarded," cried I, gratified at the prospect of being allowed upon the scene of action. "I can hinder any one from coming in that way, if—" Here I paused, conscious of something, I could hardly say what, that bade me be cautious and weigh my words well. "If you desire it and will give me the authority to act for you," I added in a somewhat more indifferent tone. "I do desire it," he replied shortly, moving over to the table and taking up a card. "Here is a ticket that will ensure you entrance into the grounds. The rest you will manage without scandal. I do not want any disturbance, but if you see any one hanging about the house or peering into the windows, or attempting to enter in any way except through the front door, you are to arrest them, no matter who they are. I have an especial reason for desiring my wishes attended to in this regard," he went on, not noticing the preoccupation that had seized me, "and will pay well if on the morrow I will find that everything has gone off according to my desires." "Money is a powerful incentive to duty," I rejoined, with marked emphasis, directing a sly glance at the mirror opposite, in whose depths I had but a moment before been startled by the sudden apparition of the pale and strongly agitated face of young Mr. Benson, who was peering from a doorway half hidden by a screen at our back. "I will be on hand to night." And with what I meant to be a cynical look, I made my bow and disappeared from the room. End of Part 2 of Chapter 1. Part 3 of Chapter 1 of XYZ, a Detective Story, by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Part 3 of Chapter 1. The Rendezvous. As I expected, I was met at the front door by Mr. Hartley. "A word with you," said he. "Jonas tells me you are from the constable of the town. May I ask what has gone amiss, that you come here to disturb my father on a day like this?" His tone was not unkind, his expression not without suavity. If I had not had imprinted on my memory the startling picture of his face as I had seen it an instant before in the mirror, I should have been tempted to believe in his goodness and integrity at this moment. As it was, I doubted him through and through, yet replied with frankness and showed him the ticket I had received from his father. "And you are going to make it your business to guard the grounds to night?" he asked. gloomily glancing at the card in my hand as if he would like to annihilate it. "Yes," said I. He drew me into a small room half filled with plants. "Now," said he, "see here. Such a piece of interference is entirely uncalled for, and you have been alarming my father unnecessarily. There are no rowdies in this town, and if one or two of the villagers should get into the grounds, where is the harm? They cannot get into the house even if they wanted to, which they don't. I do not wish this, our first show of hospitality, to assume a hostile aspect, and whatever my father's expectations may be, I must request you to curtail your duties as much as possible, and limit them to responding by your presence when called upon." "But your father has a right to expect the fullest obedience to his wishes," I protested. "He would not be satisfied if I should do no more than you request, and I cannot afford to disappoint him." He looked at me with a calculating eye, and I expected to see him put his hand in his pocket, but Hartley Benson played his cards better than that. "Very well," said he. "If you persist in regarding my father's wishes as paramount, I have nothing to say. Fulfill your duties as you conceive them, but don't look for my support if any foolish misadventure makes you ashamed of yourself." And drawing back, he motioned me out of the room. I felt I had received a check, and hurried out of the house. But scarcely had I entered upon the walk that led down to the gate, when I heard a light step behind me. Turning, I encountered the pretty daughter of the house, the youthful Miss Carey. "Wait," she cried, allowing herself to display her emotion freely in face and bearing. "I have heard who you are from my brother," she continued, approaching me with a soft grace that at once put me upon my guard. "Now tell me who are the rowdies that threaten to invade our grounds?" "I do not know their names, miss," I responded, "but they are a rough-looking set you would not like to see among your guests." "There are no very rough-looking men in our village," she declared. "You must be mistaken in regard to them. My father is nervous and easily alarmed. It was wrong to arouse his fears." I thought of that steady eye of his, of force sufficient to hold in awe a regiment of insurgents, and smiled at her opinion of my misunderstanding. "Then you do not wish the grounds guarded?" I said, in as indifferent a tone as I could assume. "I do not consider it necessary." "But I have already pledged myself to fulfill your father's commands." "I know," she said, drawing a step nearer, with a most enchanting smile. "And that was right under the circumstances. But we, his children, who may be presumed to know more of social matters than a recluse, I especially," she added, with a certain emphasis, "tell you it is not necessary. We fear the scandal it may cause. Besides, some of the guests may choose to linger about the grounds under the trees, and would be rather startled at being arrested as intruders." "What then do you wish me to do?" I asked, leaning toward her with an appearance of yielding. "To accept this money," she murmured, blushing, "and confine yourself to night to remaining in the background unless called upon." This was a seconding of her brother's proposition with a vengeance. Taking the purse she handed me, I weighed it for a moment in my hand, and then slowly shook my head. "Impossible," I cried. "But," and I fixed my eyes intently upon her countenance, "if there is any one in particular whom you desire me to ignore, I am ready to listen to a description of this person. It has always been my pleasure to accommodate myself as much as possible to the whims of the ladies." It was a bold stroke that might have cost me the game. Indeed, I half expected she would raise her voice and order some of the men about her to eject me from the grounds. But instead of that, she remained for a moment blushing painfully, but surveying me with an unfaltering gaze that reminded me of her father's. "There is a person," said she, in a low, restrained voice, "whom I am especially anxious should remain unmolested, whatever he may or may not be seen to do. He is a guest," she went on, a sudden pallor taking the place of her blushes, "and has a right to be here, but I doubt if he at once enters the house, and I even suspect he may choose to loiter awhile in the grounds before attempting to join the company. I ask you to allow him to do so." I bowed with an appearance of great respect. "Describe him," said I. For a moment she faltered with a distressed look I found it difficult to understand. Then, with a sudden glance over my person, exclaimed: "Look in the glass when you get home and you will see the facsimile of his form, though not of his face. He is fair, whereas you are dark," and with a haughty lift of her head calculated to rob me of any satisfaction I might have taken in her words, she stepped slowly back. I stopped her with a gesture. "Miss," said I, "take your purse before you go. Payment of any service I may render your father will come in time. This affair is between you and me, and I hope I am too much of a gentleman to accept money for accommodating a lady in so small a matter as this." But she shook her head. "Take it," said she, "and assure me that I may rely on you." "You may rely on me without the money," I replied, forcing the purse back into her hand. "Then I shall rest easy," she returned, and retreated with a lightsome air toward the house. The next moment I was on the highway with my thoughts. What did it all mean? Was it, then, a mere love affair across which I had foolishly stumbled, and was I busying myself unnecessarily about a rendezvous that might mean no more than an elopement from under a severe father's eye? Taking out the note which had led to all these efforts on my part, I read it for the third time. "All goes well. The time has come. Everything is in train, and success is certain. Be in the shrubbery at the northeast corner of the grounds at 9 P.M. precisely. You will be given a mask and such other means as are necessary to ensure you the accomplishment of the end you have in view. He cannot hold out against a surprise. The word by which you will know your friends is counterfeit." A love letter, of course, and I had been a fool to suppose it anything else. The young people are to surprise the old gentleman in the presence of their friends. They have been secretly married, perhaps, who knows, and take this method of obtaining a public reconciliation. But that word counterfeit, and the sinister tone of Hartley Benson as he said, "It shall not fail through lack of effort on my part." Such a word and such a tone did not rightly tally with this theory. Few brothers take such interest in their sisters' love affairs as to grow saturnine over them. There was, beneath all this, something which I had not yet penetrated. Meantime, my duty led me to remain true to the one person of whose integrity of purpose I was most thoroughly convinced. Returning to the village, I hunted up Mr. White and acquainted him with what I had undertaken in his name, and then perceiving that the time was fast speeding by, strolled over to the tavern for my supper. The stranger was still there, walking up and down the sitting room. He joined us at the table, but I observed he scarcely tasted his food, and both then and afterwards manifested the same anxious suspense that had characterized his movements from the time of our first encounter. End of Part 3 of Chapter 1. Part 1 of Chapter 2 of XYZ, a detective story by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Part 1 of Chapter 2, The Black Domino. At 8:30 I was at my post. The mysterious stranger, still under my direct surveillance, had already entered the grounds and taken his stand in the southwest corner of the shrubbery, thereby leaving me free to exercise my zeal in keeping the fences and gates free of intruders. At 9 the guests were nearly if not all assembled, and promptly at the hour mentioned in the note so often referred to, I stole away from my post and hid myself amid the bushes that obscured the real place of rendezvous. It was a retired spot, eminently fitted for a secret meeting. The lamps, which had been hung in profusion through the grounds, had been studiously excluded from this quarter. Even the broad blaze of light that poured from the open doors and windows of the brilliantly illuminated mansion sent no glimmer through the broad belt of evergreens that separated this retreat from the open lawn beyond. All was dark, all was mysterious, all was favorable to the daring plan I had undertaken. In silence I awaited the sound of approaching steps. My suspense was of short duration. In a few moments I heard a low rustle in the bushes near me, then a form appeared before my eyes, and a man's voice whispered, "Is there any one here?" My reply was to glide quietly into view. Instantly he spoke again, this time with more assurance. "Are you ready for a counterfeit?" "I am ready for anything," I returned, in smothered tones, hoping by thus disguising my voice to lure him into a revelation of the true purpose of this mysterious rendezvous. But instead of the explanations I expected, the person before me made a quick movement, and I felt a domino thrown over my shoulders. "Draw it about you well," he murmured. "There are lynx eyes in the crowd to night." And while I mechanically obeyed, he bent down to my ear and earnestly continued: "Now listen, and be guided by my instructions. You will not be able to enter by the front door, as it is guarded, and you cannot pass without removing your mask. But the window on the left hand balcony is at your service. It is open, and the man appointed to keep intruders away has been bribed to let you pass. Once inside the house, join the company sans cérémonie. And do not hesitate to converse with any one who addresses you by the countersign. Promptly at 10 o'clock, look around you for a domino in plain black. When you see him move, follow him, but with discretion, so that you may not seem to others to be following. Sooner or later he will pause and point to a closed door. Notice that door, and when your guide has disappeared, approach and enter it without fear or hesitation. You will find yourself in a small apartment connecting with a library. There is but one thing more to say. If the wineglass you will observe on the library table smells of wine, you may know your father has had his nightly potion and has gone to bed. But if it contains nothing more than a small white powder, you may be certain he has yet to return to the library, and that by waiting you will have the long wished for opportunity of seeing him." And pausing for no reply, my strange companion suddenly thrust a mask into my hand and darted from the circle of trees that surrounded us. For a moment I stood dumbfounded at the position in which my recklessness had placed me. All the folly, the impertinence even, of the proceeding upon which I had entered, was revealed to me in its true colors, and I mentally inquired what could have induced me to thus hamper myself with the details of a mystery so entirely removed from the serious matter I had in charge. Resolved to abandon the affair, I made a hasty attempt to disengage myself from the domino in which I had been so unceremoniously enveloped. But invisible hands seemed to restrain me. A vivid remembrance of the tone in which these final instructions had been uttered returned to my mind, and while I recognized the voice as that of Hartley Benson, I also recognized the almost saturnine intensity of expression which had once before imbued his words with a significance both forcible and surprising. The secret, if a purely family one, was of no ordinary nature, and at the thought I felt my old interest revive. All the excuses with which I had hitherto silenced my conscience recurred to me with fresh force, and mechanically donning my mask, I prepared to follow out my guide's instructions to the last detail. The window to which I had been directed stood wide open. Through it came the murmur of music and the hum of gay voices. Visions of a motley crowd decked in grotesque costumes passed constantly before my eyes. Sight and sound combined to allure me. Hurrying to the window, I stepped carelessly in. A low guttural "How" at once greeted me. It was from a mask in full Indian costume, whom I saw leaning with a warrior's well known dignity against the embrasure of the window by which I had entered. Giving him a scrutinizing glance, I came to the conclusion he was a young and not inelegant man, and impelled by a reasonable curiosity as to how I looked myself, I cast my eyes down upon my own person. I found my appearance sufficiently striking. The domino in which I was wrapped was of a brilliant yellow hue, covered here and there with black figures representing all sorts of fantastic creatures, from hobgoblins of a terrible type to Mary Kate Greenaway silhouettes. Thought I, It seems I am not destined to glide unnoticed amid the crowd. The first person who approached me was a gay little shepherdess. "Aha!" was the sportive exclamation with which she greeted me. "Here's one of my wandering sheep!" And with a laugh she endeavored to hook me to her side by means of her silver crook. But this blithesome puppet possessed no interest for me, so with a growl and a bound I assured her I was nothing more than a wolf in sheep's clothing and would eat her up if she did not run away, at which she gaily laughed and vanished, and for a moment I was left alone. But only for a moment. A masked lady, whom I had previously observed standing upright and solitary in a distant corner of the room, now approached, and taking me by the arm, led me eagerly to one side. "Oh, Joe," she whispered, "is it you? How glad I am to have you here, and how I hope we are going to be happy at last." Fearing to address a person seemingly so well acquainted with the young man whose place I had usurped, I merely pressed, with most perfidious duplicity, the little hand that was so confidingly clasped in mine. It seemed to satisfy her, for she launched at once into ardent speech. "Oh, Joe, I have been so anxious to have you with us once again. Hartley is a good brother, but he is not my old playmate. Then father will be so much happier if you only succeed in making him forget the past." Seeing by this that it was Miss Carrie Benson with whom I had to deal, I pressed the little hand again, and tenderly drew her closer to my side. That I felt all the time like a villain of the blackest dye, it is quite unnecessary for me to state. "Has Hartley told you just what you are to do?" was her next remark. "Father is very determined not to relent and has kept himself locked in his library all day, for fear you should force yourself upon his presence. I could never have gained his consent to give this ball if I had not first persuaded him it would serve as a means to keep you at a distance, that if you saw the house thronged with guests, natural modesty would restrain you from pushing yourself forward. I think he begins to distrust his own firmness. He fears he will melt at the sight of you. He has been failing this last year and—" A sudden choke stopped her voice. I was at once both touched and alarmed. Touched at the grief which showed her motives to be pure and good, and alarmed at the position in which I had thrust myself to the apparent detriment of these same laudable motives. Moved by a desire to right matters, I ventured to speak. "And do you think," I whispered, in purposely smothered accents, "that if he sees me he will relent?" "I am sure of it. He yearns over you, Joe, and if he had not sworn never to speak to you again, he would have sent for you long ago. Hartley believes as well as I that the time for reconciliation has come." "And is Hartley," I ventured again, not without a secret fear of the consequences, "really anxious for reconciliation?" "Oh, Joe, can you doubt it? Has he not striven from the first to make father forget? Would he encourage you to come here to night, furnish you with a disguise, and consent to act both as your champion and adviser, if he did not want to see you and father friends again? You don't understand Hartley. You never have. You would not have repelled his advances so long if you had realized how truly he had forgiven everything and forgotten it. Hartley has the pride of a person who has never done wrong himself, but even pride gives way before brotherly affection, and you have suffered so much and so long. Poor Joe!" So, thought I. Joe is then the aggressor, and for a moment I longed to be the man I represented, if only to clasp this dear little sister in my arms and thank her for her goodness. "You are a darling," I faintly articulated, inwardly determined to rush forthwith into the garden, hand over my domino to the person for whom it was intended, and make my escape from a scene which I had so little right to enjoy. But at this instant an interruption occurred which robbed me of my companion, but kept me effectually in my place. A black domino swept by us, dragging Miss Benson from my side, while at the same time a harsh voice whispered in my ear, "To counterfeit wrong, when one is right, necessarily opens one to misunderstanding." End of part 1 of chapter 2. Part 2 of Chapter 2 of XYZ, A Detective Story by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Part 2 of Chapter 2, The Black Domino. I started, recognizing in this mode of speech a friend, and therefore one from whom I could not escape without running the risk of awakening suspicion. "That is true," I returned, hoping by my abrupt replies to short cut this fresh colloquy and win a speedy release. But something in my answer roused the interest of the person at my side, and caused a display of emotion that led to quite an opposite result from what I desired. "You awaken 1,000 conjectures in my mind by that reply," exclaimed my friend, edging me a little farther back from the crowd. "I have always had my doubts about," he paused, hunting for the proper phrase, "about your having done what they said," he somewhat lamely concluded. "It was so unlike you. But now I begin to see the presence of a possibility that you might perhaps explain much we never understood. Joe, my boy, you never said you were innocent, but—" "Who are you?" I asked boldly, peering into the twinkling eyes that shone upon me from his sedate mask. In the discussion of such matters as these it would be dreadful to make a mistake. "And don't you recognize your Uncle Joe?" he asked, with a certain plaintive reproach somewhat out of keeping with his costume of potent, grave, and reverend signor. "I came over from Hollowell on purpose because Carrie intimated that you were going to make one final effort to see your father. Edith is here too," he murmured, thrusting his face alarmingly near mine. "She would not stay away, though we were all afraid she might betray herself. Her emotions are so quick. Poor child, she never doubted you. And if my suspicions are correct—" "Edith," I interrupted. "Edith?" "An Edith was the last person I desired to meet under these circumstances. Where is she?" I tremulously inquired, starting aside in some dismay at the prospect of encountering this unknown quantity of love and devotion. But my companion, seizing me by the arm, drew me back. "She is not far away, of that you may be sure. But it will never do for you to try and hunt her up. You would not know her in her mask. Besides, if you remain still, she will come to you." That was just what I feared, but upon looking around and seeing no suspicious looking damsel anywhere near me, I concluded to waive my apprehensions on her account, and proceeded to the development of an idea that had been awakened by the old gentleman's words. "You are right," I acquiesced, edging, in my turn, toward the curtained recess of a window near by. "Let us wait here, and meantime you shall tell me what your suspicions are, for I feel the time has come for the truth to be made known, and who would better aid me in proclaiming it than you who have always stood my friend?" "That is true," he murmured, all eagerness at once. Then, in a lower tone and with a significant gesture, "There is something, then, which has never been made known? Edith was right when she said you did not steal the bonds out of your father's desk?" As he paused and looked me in the face, I was obliged to make some reply. I chose one of the non-committal sort. "Don't ask me," I murmured, turning away with every appearance of profound agitation. He did not suspect the ruse. "But, my boy, I shall have to ask you. If I am to help you out of this scrape, I must know the truth. Yet, if it is as I suspect, I can see why you should hesitate even now. You are a generous fellow, Joe, but even generosity can be carried past its proper limits." "Uncle," I exclaimed, leaning over him and whispering tremulously in his ear, "what are your suspicions? If I hear you give utterance to them, perhaps it will not be so hard for me to speak." He hesitated, looked all about us with a questioning glance, put his mouth to my ear, and whispered, "If I should use the name of Hartley in connection with what I have to say, would you be so very much surprised?" With a quick semblance of emotion, I drew back. "You think—" I tremulously commenced, and as suddenly broke off. That it was he who did it, and that you, knowing how your father loved him and built his hopes upon him, bore the blame of it yourself." "Ha!" I exclaimed, with a deep breath as of relief. The suspicions of Uncle Joe were worth hearing. He seemed to be satisfied with the ejaculation, and with an increase of eagerness in his tone went quickly on. "Am I not right, my boy? Is not this the secret of your whole conduct from that dreadful day to this?" "Don't ask me," I again pleaded, taking care, however, to draw a step nearer and exclaim in almost the same breath: "Why should you think it must necessarily have been one of us? What did you know that you should be so positive it was either he or I who committed this dishonest action?" "What did I know? Why, what everybody else did. That your father, hearing a noise in his study one night, rose up quietly and slipped to the door of communication in time to hear a stealthy foot leave the room and proceed down the hall toward the apartment usually occupied by you and your brother. That, alarmed and filled with vague distrust, he at once lit the lamp, only to discover his desk had been forcibly broken into and a number of coupon bonds taken out. That, struck to the heart, he went immediately to the room where you and your brother lay, found him lying quiet, and to all appearances asleep, while you looked flushed, and with difficulty met his eye. That without hesitation he thereupon accused you of theft, and began to search the apartment. That you found the bonds, as we both know, in a cupboard at the head of your bed, and when you were asked if you had put them there you remained silent, and neither then nor afterward made any denial of being the one who stole them." A mournful "yes" was all the reply I ventured upon. "Now it never seemed to occur to your father to doubt your guilt. The open window and the burglar's jimmy found lying on the floor of the study being only so many proofs, to his mind, of your deep calculation and great duplicity. But I could not help thinking, even on that horrible morning, that your face did not wear a look of guilt so much as it did that of firm and quiet resolution. But I was far from suspecting the truth, my boy, or I should never have allowed you to fall a victim to your father's curse, and be sent forth like a criminal from home and kindred. If only for Edith's sake I would have spoken, dear, trusting, faithful girl that she is." But," I brokenly ejaculated, anxious to gain as much of the truth as was possible in the few minutes allotted me, "what has awakened your suspicions at this late day? Why should you doubt Hartley now, if you did not then?" "Well, I cannot really say. Perhaps Edith's persistent aversion to your brother has had something to do with it. Then he has grown cold and hard, while you have preserved your boyish freshness and affection. I don't like him, that is the truth, and with my dislike arose doubts, and well, I cannot tell how it is, but I will believe you if you say he was the one to blame in this matter, and what is more, your father will believe you too, for he does not feel the same satisfaction in Hartley's irreproachable character that he used to, and a sudden movement in the crowd stopped him. A tall, graceful looking woman clad entirely in white had just entered the room and seemed to be making her way toward us. "There's Edith," he declared. "She is hunting for the yellow domino ornamented with black that she has been told conceals her lover. Shall I go and fetch her here, or will you wait here until she spies you of your own accord?" "I will wait," I uneasily replied, edging nearer to the window with the determination of using it as a means of escape if my companion only gave me the chance. "See, she is in the hands of an old Jew who seems to be greatly taken with the silver trimmings on her sleeves. Suppose you improve the opportunity to slip away," I laughingly suggested. "Lovers' meetings are not usually of an order to interest third parties." "Aren't they, you rogue?" returned the old gentleman, giving me a jocose poke in the ribs. "Well, well, I suppose you are right. But you have not told me—" "I will tell you everything in an hour," I hastily assured him. "I am going to meet my father in the library, and after he has heard the truth, You shall be admitted, and all will be explained." "That is only fair," he replied. "Your father has the first rights, of course. But Joe, my boy, remember I am not over and above patient of disposition, and don't keep me waiting too long." And with an affectionate squeeze of my hand, he stepped out from the recess where we stood and made his way once more into the throng. No sooner had he left my side than I threw up the window. Now is the time for the real Joe to appear upon the scene, was my mental decision. I have done for him what he as a gentleman would probably never do for himself, pumped this old party and got everything in trim for Hartley's discomfiture. But the courting business is another matter, also the interview with the outraged father in the library. That cannot be done by proxy. So here goes for a change of actors." And with reckless disregard of consequences, I prepared to jump from the window, when a sudden light flashed over the lawn beneath, and I saw I was at least 12 feet from the ground. "Well," I exclaimed, drawing hastily back, "such a leap as that is too much to expect of any man." And with the humiliating consciousness of being caught in a trap, I proceeded to close the window. "Joe!" It was a low whisper, but how thrilling! Turning, I greeted, with the show of fervor I considered necessary to the occasion, the white veiled lady who had glided into my retreat. "Did you think I was never coming, Joe? Everybody who could get in my way certainly managed to do so. Then Hartley is so suspicious, and followed me with his eyes so persistently, I did not dare to show my designs too plainly. It is only this minute he left my side. If he had been anywhere else, I do not know as I should have succeeded even now in getting a word with you. Oh!" This exclamation was called forth by a sudden movement that took place near us. The curtain was drawn back and a tall man dressed in a black domino glanced in, gave us a scrutinizing look, bowed, and dropped the curtain again. "Hartley," she whisperingly explained. I took her by the hand. There was no help for it. Gesture and a lover-like demeanor must, in this case, supply the place of speech. "Hush!" she entreated. Not that I had spoken. "I dare not stay. When you have seen your father, perhaps I will have courage to join you. But now it would be better for me to go." And her eyes roamed towards the curtain, while the little hand I held in mine grew cold and slightly trembled. I pressed that little hand, but, as you may well believe, did not urge her to remain. Yet she did not seem in a hurry to depart, and I do not know what complications might have ensued if another movement in the curtain had not reawakened her fears and caused her, notwithstanding her evident reluctance, to start quickly away. I did not linger long behind her. Scarcely had the curtain fallen from her hand that I stepped hastily forth. But alas for my hope of escape! No sooner had I joined the group of merrymakers circling about the open door, than I felt a touch on my arm, and looking up, saw before me the black domino. The hour of 10 had struck and my guide to the library was at hand. There was no alternative left for me but to follow him. End of Part 2 of Chapter 2.